Hello, welcome to the ARC workshop on implementing research. We're going to talk a little bit today about how to find, but also utilize sources for your research paper. Our first step is that you want to find reliable resources. Finding good sources starts with choosing your topic. You want to make sure you start with a thesis or topic that's narrow or specific enough to research, so you have enough specific phrases and keywords to search that you'll actually find something substantive and not just a bunch of unrelated articles about your general topic, but also broad enough that you're still going to find a variety of sources, not so specific that there's maybe only one or two things out there published about it. If you have a thesis already, you want to search for the main points of it as well as any relevant context. So if we start with this thesis, we want to begin with the overall context. So that might be background or history. For here, we could look up maybe historical examples of classism. And then you want to move to more specific. So we would begin with the broad, what are historical examples? And then this specifically, where else have things like this happened? And you want to move towards ever more specific questions. So think of it as a stream narrowing. You start with a big river and then you get down to like a really little trickle. Sometimes though, you don't have a thesis yet. So if you're going to be starting with just a topic, you want to have a general idea about the subject that you're going to talk about. And then you're going to narrow it down to your research subject. So if you want to write about, let's say for a psychology paper, anxiety, ask yourself, what about anxiety? Is there maybe a specific kind that you would like to focus on? You can look at who does it affect or what causes it, what are specific symptoms. So see, we're starting with a general idea, and then we're getting ever more narrow to build not only what we might turn into our thesis, but also what we're going to start with as our research search terms by asking directed questions about that topic. So some of the things that it might be helpful to ask those questions about include the time period and location. Going to be things like gender, race, class, nationality, things that give more context, and then cause and effect. And then it can also be helpful to look at how your topic relates to things in a larger context. So things like history, where does it fit in a historical context? What's the history of it? Things like economics, does it have any economic implications? Things like culture, how do different cultures perceive this thing, or how does it exist or present in different cultures? It can be really helpful to start with the basic question words, so like who, what, why, when, where. Much like we just narrowed down our line of questioning, you'll also want to be ultra specific when you're entering keywords into like a database or a journal, a library website. Try searching for more specific concepts. This will net you more results and more relevant results when you're looking for sources. So instead of, say, the broad term of politics, you would want to go for a more specific party or political school of thought. So it can also be helpful on databases like this to filter your sources. There's usually a little thing on the side that says sort and filter, so you might want to consider filtering them by the date. You can also filter things by the field or subject. So if you're writing a psychology paper, you might want to filter for psychology-related journals, and then also by the type of source. So things like newspapers and periodicals are going to be helpful for current events, or just a general societal opinion of things, while academic journals are better suited to more specialized research inquiries. You also want to make sure that you are evaluating your sources. So you want to make sure that they're relevant to your topic and credible in your field of study. This involves asking things like, who's the author? Look for their credentials. This is especially for academic articles, usually at the top with the title or in the abstract. But you also want to do this for less traditional academic sources. So how are they connected to the subject? And you also want to look at things like, where was the source published? Was it published in a peer-reviewed journal or a trusted periodical? A scientific paper would probably necessitate sources that are like vetted or published or peer-reviewed by journals or organizations specific to that science. While a humanities paper might use sources whose value is more historical or representative of societal opinions. So once you've got all your research gathered, we're going to talk a little bit now about how to start incorporating into your paper. So the first thing you're going to do is introduce it. It's important to build credibility for the source. So you know from your research that that source is credible, but you want to make it clear to your reader of your paper why and how that source is a trusted source. So to do this, you want to give some background on the source's author or publisher. You might mention the time the source was published to establish recency or historical relevance, like the year. You'll always want to include what type of source it is. So mention whether you're talking about an article, a study, an interview, and also any relevant information about the author. Once you are into talking more specifically about your research, after you've already introduced it, you're going to make use of this thing called a signal phrase. A template that allows you to seamlessly integrate your research into a paper. You want to blend it with your own sentence structure. So instead of just plopping down a quote from another source that might not match or really fit into the structure that you're building in your own paper, you want to seamlessly attach it to your own sentence structure. This will make it easier both for you to connect your evidence with your reasoning or your analysis, so connect it back to your argument and your thesis, and it'll also make it easier for the reader to follow your paper. So here we have an example. You want to start with the source, then a connecting phrase, which we'll talk about a little bit on the next slide. But that's going to be just something that seamlessly kind of connects your introduction of the source and your evidence from the source. Then you'll have your quote, and then you can add an optional piece on the end that will draw information out of the quote or emphasize the relevancy to your paper. So this will do the work of connecting it back to your thesis and start the analysis process. So here's some examples of some of those connecting phrases that you'll want to use in your signal phrases. So you'll start with the author or the source, and then to connect it to the quote, you can use things like explains, asserts, finds, suggests, concludes. One of the pieces of evidence that you're going to use when you're incorporating your sources into your paper is a quotation. Quotation involves directly copying a source word for word. So it's taking a little small chunk of a source and putting it directly into your paper. Your quotation should have quotation marks around it, and inside the quotation marks should appear in your writing exactly as it does in the original source. You should quote when you're trying to establish the credibility of an author, so you include a little snippet of their logic and reasoning. You want to showcase an author's knowledge to support your stance. Quotes should be used for more supplementary information. They're evidence that supports your overall stance, and they're also often used to define something very specific to a niche topic. One way to seamlessly incorporate a quote that would otherwise be lengthy or bulky is by selecting the relevant information, and then denoting that it comes from a larger quote. With ellipses. So you want to put 3 dots, that's an ellipses, in the place of the words that you're omitting from the quote. So this little ellipsis ... indicates to us, the reader of your paper, that in the original source, while this quote was exactly the same, it had a preceding introduction to the quote that doesn't necessarily fit into our paper structure. And then another way that you might want to alter the specific phrasing of a quote to fit into your own sentence structure is to change, say, a pronoun or preposition. So if the article states that we discovered that something, it might make more sense in your own analysis of the quote to fit into your sentence structure to say they discovered that. The way that you're going to do this to change the quote for clarity is to put the changed portion in brackets, Beyond defining something, expanding the reader's knowledge, or affirming your credibility, you, as the writer, need to demonstrate that you can analyze the quote and connect it back to your thesis and argument. You want to make sure that it's evidence supporting something you're saying and not just parroting something that the original author said to fill up space. Paraphrasing is the next way that we are going to incorporate research into our paper. So, in contrast to a direct quote, paraphrasing is representing outside ideas from other sources in your writing. So instead of putting it word for word, you want to dramatically change the sentence structure, wording, and phrasing to make the thought your own, while still giving a sense of the outside source's ideas. So you want to paraphrase when you're trying to make a passage clear or reiterate the context, if you want to give a brief explanation of the original work, or if you notice that you've provided a lot of quotes and you just don't want too many cluttering up your paper. So, summarizing, as opposed to paraphrasing, is giving a brief background of the material that you've read, watched, or listened to. So you want to summarize when you're trying to provide an overview of the topic, or you're trying to provide more context or information of the topic. So a summary is going to go over all the points and the basic gist of a source that you're talking about, while paraphrasing is going to take more specific ideas out of that source and represent them in your paper or explain what they are, so that you can talk about why they're relevant to your argument. Now we're going to apply the evidence. So you want to make sure that your evidence, any quotes, paraphrasing, and other information that you draw from your sources, are connected back to your argument or main idea. You want to connect each piece of evidence to a subclaim that's the main idea of one of your body paragraphs, and or your thesis, that's your main argument. Your evidence might illustrate a point that you're trying to make, or provide a concrete data to back up your argument. You want to make sure to connect the dots for the reader, though, rather than leaving them to make the connection between the evidence and your thesis themselves. The point of your paper is to do the work of making those connections, and lay out a clear line of logic for the reader as to how your research fits together to support your stance. So you don't want to just leave evidence hanging with no explanation of how it connects to your main point. Now we're going to talk about what a synthesis is. It is a type of paper which is building upon an idea based off of two or more sources. So it's going to use a combination of sources to build up to a larger idea and the point of your paper, your thesis, as opposed to an analysis paper, which is breaking down one or a few main sources. So, for example, if you're writing a literature paper, an analysis paper might take one source, like one book or one poem, and analyze it, so to break it down and talk about, the themes, the context, whereas a synthesis would take many sources and build up to a larger idea. So you might take many sources of criticism or literature from a whole time period to build up to a larger point that you're making about a broader subject. In-text citations. So for MLA in-text citations, you're going to use the author name and the page number, if there is one, with no punctuation. APA in-text citations are going to look similar, but they're going to require a little bit more information. They want the author, the year, and the page number separated by commas, in that order. Page numbers in APA should be denoted with a lowercase p with a period for a singular page, and two lowercase p's with a period for a range. Lastly, we're going to talk about where you're going to put your in-text citations. This is often a subject of confusion. In the sentence where you're going to want to put the in-text citation is after the quotation mark, outside of the quotation mark, but before the period. When you're paraphrasing, you want to cite after each general idea from a source. So if you're quoting, the citation is going to go directly after the quote. But when you're paraphrasing, instead of after each sentence, you just want to cite after each general idea from a source. But you always want to make sure to cite the sources you used before moving on or switching to a new idea or source. So the point is to make it clear that if you're mentioning evidence, even if it's not a direct quote. The reader can find its source by referring to the in-text citation that comes directly after it. Now that you've learned about how to implement your research in a paper, try testing your knowledge with this Kahoot quiz.